and welcome to the Booster Pack. My name is Rance, and this is the show where we unwrap the stories and crack the mysteries of collectible games each and every episode. And today, we are going to wind back the collectible card game clock, and we're going to follow history's path on an adventure that will lead us all the way back to the very first decade of this formative, all-encompassing gaming genre. Yes, I'm not worried though, because we are going to be joined by somebody in our company. That's right, one of tabletop gaming's most lauded veterans. Yes, our guest today is in fact somebody who not only designed one of the most loved collectible card games of all time, but they are also somebody who worked on several RPGs and many board games that became foundational in the 20th century gaming space. Yes, this guest got their career start way back in the 1980s, working on books and products that would become the iconic Rollmaster Fantasy RPG system, and then they also were lucky enough to join the very brave fellowship that would craft the Middle Earth role-playing game system. Now, as impressive as that is, it wasn't just in pen and paper that their career took off. In fact, it might interest you to know, in later years, they helped expand one of the most influential European board games into the English-speaking world. That game, of course, is Catan, or as it was formerly known, Settlers Catan. Regardless, I'm sure you've heard about it. So, as extraordinary as those titles are, it's not actually why they're here today. Today, they are joining us as the designer on one of the most vast, deeply flavorful collectible card games of all time, and one that preceded a certain epic trilogy of Hollywood movies. Now, using the clues you've received so far, I'm sure you've guessed that this designer's work has expanded outside the role-playing game space when it comes to Tolkien, and it extended into the collectible card game era. Yes, of course, I am talking about the immersive, award-winning Middle Earth CCG, and we are joined by a designer from it. That's right, join me in welcoming to the Booster Pack somebody who spent nearly 2 decades translating Tolkien's imagination into the world of gaming. I am elated and I am honored to be able to say the following sentence. Welcome to the show, Coleman Charton. Coleman, how do you do, bud?
Oh, how you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for joining me today. This is such a privilege, and I can't wait to talk about your long and vast history in gaming.
Yeah, I love telling tales about the old days. So, but I love it so much you have to stop me if I get carried away.
Oh, everything is gravy from this point on. I cannot wait to hear. Now, let's jump in, but not too deep just yet. Let's start with the fringes. So tell me all about how you found your way into being a gamer. Like before you were a professional, how did you find your time becoming somebody who loved gaming?
Well, in high school, I would play chess and cards and things like that. And my parents played bridge. My mother must have been in 4 or 5 bridge clubs, and that was the gaming of their day. When I went to college, my 3rd year, I was in the dormitories that were on campus at the University of Virginia, and someone told me there was a board game club, and I went to Morey Hall, which was the ROTC building, and in those days, ROTC was controversial to say the least. It was the Vietnam War, and it was very much a emotional thing. But in Morey Hall, it was everybody played, and we played a few Avalon Hill games and lots of war games with the little hexes and the counters. And somebody came, and they had a copy of a brand new game called Dungeons and Dragons, and it was the small books, and it was mid-70s, and a colonel in the Army was at UVA to go to the JAG school, the law school, and he started up a game. But one of the most unlikely guys.
Yeah, you don't often hear of somebody who has a rank in the military starting Dungeons and Dragons games way back in the mid-70s.
And he would a stickler for the rules, even though the rules were loose and horrible. He would run them legitimately.
And then the game continued from there. Now, tell me, obviously, at some point, I've heard that you sort of connected with the group that would ultimately end up becoming ICE or Iron Crown Enterprises through role-playing. Tell me how you went from, playing with a colonel in the army to the group that ultimately would become your professional colleague.
It was in the first game that Dick Bailey was the officer, and Pete was in the game, and Pete's wife-to-be was not yet in the game. So I already knew half dozen people from the role playing, But Pete's wife, Olivia, was in school, and I'd say six people in ICE claimed to have helped them meet, hook up, and get married. She worked at the student cafeteria, knew 2 people, and they said, "Oh, you'll have to come to this great game," because women were few and far behind. And so I lived on the same street as her, and I was a true geek. I'm a geek now, but I was really a geek. But I got my courage up. I went and knocked on her door. She came to the door, and I told her about the game and told her we'd really love it if she'd come. So I helped. She knew several other people that helped get it. So they joined up, and that's how the group coalesced, because Pete would run this game much more frequently than he would have if he hadn't been going out with Olivia.
I mean, what a great dating opportunity, Dungeons and Dragons.
But he had to be, in order to keep the trust a GM has to have, he couldn't cut her any slack. So she died many times more than, so they eventually ended up getting married, and Pete took over the game from Dick Bailey when he went to West Point.
Wow. Okay. So for those who don't know, Pete Fenton is one of the founders of Iron Crown that you guys obviously work with, and was probably like the leader of the company for many, many years, and has gone on to many great things. But that's an amazing little insight. Now, I've heard that game actually evolved into, as you said, that was a Tolkien fan amongst you, evolved into a Middle Earth style game. Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, Pete graduated a year before Olivia and moved to North Virginia. And he came back every other week to Charlottesville to run his game and see Olivia. And every other weekend, she would go up to Northern Virginia and visit him. So we managed to do that. And we would run sessions. We were crazy. We were going to be running a 2-day session. And Olivia got off work at 1 o'clock because she was the manager of the local watering hole at the university. Instead of sleeping for 8 hours and starting fresh for the game, we started up as soon as she got off shift. It was definitely a great campaign. And Pete would work. He worked at the Navy Federal Union, a bank, and he could get his work done in 8 hours, a 40-hour week in 8 hours. He would spend 32 hours a week with unlimited Xerox, which was very important then.
Plenty of character sheets.
Yeah, we developed proto Rollmaster through that process.
Well, let's get into that. So tell me how you guys go from, a gaming group of friends who loved playing for hours and hours on end and deprive yourselves from sleep, to being a group of people who found a role-playing game company.
Well, we had some problems with Dungeons and Dragons. Mainly the mechanisms for combat. So we developed our Armsel, which is the combat system.
Well, that's awesome, and that system would sort of evolve from arms lore into spell lore and all these other products that would eventually become as I mentioned in the intro, the iconic sort of role master system, and that was quite revolutionary in the industry way back when. Do you have any sort of, in those earliest days before you guys started working on Tolkien stuff, do you have any other exciting memories or anything that specifically stands out from that era?
Well, it took a few years because we hit the point where we wanted to start the company. Pete and a guy named Kurt Fisher had done a module, the Iron Wind, and they went and tried to get TSR to publish it, and they didn't. And we took a group up to play in a tournament. I think that was the Gen Con in Lake Geneva, Playboy Club. And you've never seen anything that's strange as a bunch of typical gamers going into a bar with bunnies and getting their Coke and refreshments.
Like, tell me any stories about how you guys orchestrated the biggest coup in gaming, but getting the Tolkien license that you guys could actually use.
It's a short story. We asked. Nobody else asked. All the other companies figured it was TSR would snap it up. But TSR they were arrogant, and they got people licensed D&D, like D&D didn't license other things. So they were almost disdainful.
So, well, obviously, over the 1980s, you guys start to expand. Obviously, the Lord of the Rings books come in. You guys start doing other things in that sort of space. You do like quest books and stuff like that. You do all sorts of Middle Earth products. But eventually, after years and years and years, we sort of fast forward to the 1990s when there's a huge revolution in gaming, which many watchers of this show will know exactly what I'm talking about. In 1993, collectible card games come out. Tell me, like, how do you remember the first arrival of collectible card games? What was your first experience with them? I assume it was Magic the Gathering. Tell me all about that.
Well, as I say, somebody brought in some sample Magic cards, and I said, "Oh, well, how much do these cost?" Well, if you really want to get started, have a decent thing, you spend 500 to 1,000. You spend lots of money, and yeah, I say so. I go in and I'm an advantage if I don't spend as much money as this nutty gamer guy. And yes, so they came back to me next week and they said, okay, we're going to have a league where we draft cards. So everybody win $50 and you got your cards, and we played a tournament and had a good time. That was the first. Now, meanwhile, we were looking for a new product line, better things to do. So we collectible card games, we said, well, we don't have any experience. Why don't we license a Middle Earth card game and just take the royalties? So we went to Wizards of the Coast, and they signed a 1-year option on Middle Earth, and they were going to do the card game of the year. They had growing pains. They were Wizards of the Coast they just had too many things to do. So they had a decision. They would put a BattleTech collectible card game or Middle Earth collectible card game. And so they, I don't know if it's Elrond or what, they said, okay, we'll do BattleTech, and then we'll do Middle Earth. Well, year comes, the option's due. They haven't started Middle Earth, so we pulled the license. They didn't think we would do it, but we did, and we got the advance back. And that's when we were faced with the dilemma of how do we put out a game.
So that's so fascinating. So we're going to jump right into, obviously, all the sort of what ended up becoming Iron Crown Enterprises or ICE's Middle Earth CCG. But before we do, tell me a little bit about that relationship with Wizards of the Coast. Now, did they do any work? Did you see anything before you guys pulled the license? Did they bring you any sort of game mechanics? Was there anything that they sort of presented to you?
No. We gave them an option. They thought, and the people that made the deal and us figured, hey, who can pass up doing Middle Earth? Well, yes, Wizards of the Coast did. They did BattleTech instead. So they come back, and nobody's done any work on it. But we need to make the Christmas season. We only had a year, okay, less than a year. So normally ICE was a publishing company. We had authors, and we would write some of the stuff ourselves, but mainly it was a publisher. And they gave the job. I was given 2 months to design the basic game. I did it in about 6 weeks. I had a prototype, and I go to the beach with my family every summer. I go to the Outer Banks and get away from it, and I don't skip it. So I gave them the prototypes, the cards and stuff, and I went to the beach. I'll come back, and they say, "Oh, had to play testing it." Well, the first game took 8 hours.
That's long for a collectible card game. Maybe not those early role-playing sessions like we talked before, but for a collectible card game, that's quite the age.
The second game took 10 minutes.
Oh, explain that to me.
Well, there's 2 ways to win. You can kill the other, or corrupt the other guy's wizard, and then you can end the game and you win. Or you can gather 20 points or 30 points, depending on how long the game is, and call the Council of Elrond, or the Council of whatever it is. And you make a corruption check. Corruption is if you have a great item or you do something, it's temptation to go to the dark side. And when they call the council to count victory points, that might be a dwarf over here, and he's got Durin's axe. And he knows if he goes to the meeting, they may take it away from him. So he skedaddles over the hill, and you lose the character and the weapon because you failed your corruption check. Okay, so it's the second way is to be corrupt. So it's points, corruption, or death. And the second playtest game, we didn't have certain rules that we put in later to handle corruption. The guy just pumped corruption on the wizard until the reason it took so long in the first one was because we had the parameters or the mission goals of putting out a card game. You couldn't be sure you'd have a board or dice, so it all had to be on cards. So Middle Earth, quickly that fell by the wayside. Everybody made a small map that you could move around on, and you roll dice. When the way you got a random number in the original one was you flipped a card over and you had a random number from 2 to 12. You use that. But that card flow in your game goes wacko. But so we started. We'd already started. We actually, while I was designing the game, the base game, the art department was lining up all the art, and we going to need 400 pieces of art, over 400.
Well, to speak to that point, the Middle Earth CCG has so much flavor built into it. There is a lot of complexity when it comes to rules, but there is so much that's going on and so many things that you can do. You know, like you said, there's so many ways to win the game, and there's so many different ways that, you know, you can either, you know, win through corruption, you can win by calling the council, you can win by dunking the ring. There is so much versatility, and you guys really built Tolkien's imagination into that game. Now, let's just jump back for a second, because I want to know a little bit more about that very, very tight sounding 6 weeks where you're designing the game. Tell me about how you approached the way you wanted to create this game. Obviously, it's a very different game to the way that Magic the Gathering works. Tell me about how you, philosophically approach creating a collectible card game for Middle Earth, especially when, no work had been done apparently from Wizards of the Coast.
Yeah. Well, I designed a game called Fellowship of the Ring that came out in the mid-'80s.
And that was a board game.
Board game. And I'd never designed a complex theme board game before that. So I dived into that, and it was too complex. We had like 16 pages of rules, and I did a condensed set of rules that would really help people. And it was a game that had 66 dice in it, one of which you rolled.
And what about the others?
65 dice, they were playing pieces. They were like Scrabble, Stratego pieces. You put the dice, and the one side would face you, and you put a sticker on it, and it would be flying mode or sneaking mode. And you could rotate the dice to get to those other numbers and things. And each turn, a playing piece could generate 2 more playing pieces. And they could either be somebody you recruit in a hex you're in, a group that joins up, or just a decoy. So you start out in the Shire with the Nazgul all around you, and the Fellowship takes off. And each character has a card, and you lay the card down, and it corresponds to dice with A on it. You can move say you've got all 4 hobbits in Aragorn, and you take the dice and you move in 1 space, or if you're going on by boat, you go 2 spaces or whatever, and you spread out. And the evil player was trying to stomp out the decoy so he can know where. That was very informative in doing the card game, because we had to have a equivalent of a map. So if you were in Rivendell was in an area called Rudall. Then you had the area that Moria is in, and you have the area that Lorien is. And to get from Rivendell to Lorien, you had to go through 3, 4 regions or spaces. And we had a card for each region. And you play the original game, you play a card. So you play Rudall, then you play Goblin Gate, then you play Northern End, then you play and you get to and each turn the guy could play hazards or bad stuff on you as you moved. So half your hand was resources and half hazards.
So this is really fascinating, because the site path mechanic was one of my favorite things in the game. So you were saying that rather than, taking that board game approach where you would be moving 1 space at a time, having this sort of site path where you can sort of play one card, then play another, and just add the sort of hazards together where it'll give the opponent more resources and more opportunity to sort of punish you for moving further, was something that you really sort of encapsulated. Now, was that inspired by that original board game design?
The breaking it down into the types of regions: wilderness, free domain, dark domain, dark hole. That was inspired. It was the same line of reasoning or the same line of design as the original board game. But the base mechanics, I think, worked very well. And the key thing, though, was that all the flavor and the additional stuff that the Tolkien people could put in. Like if Jessica, who was our art director, came across a piece of art that was good, really good Middle Earth art, but didn't have a place in the game yet, we could add a mechanism, or we could add some graphics that would make it a viable addition to the game. So we had cards that came from the mechanics, we had cards that came from Middle Earth, we had cards that came from art. People could put their egos aside and just work to get the best game we could.
So one of my favorite things about the Middle Earth CCG is that you took a really interesting approach. Rather than having characters embody, especially for the first set, rather have characters embody people like Samwise Gamgee or Frodo or anything like that. You chose that the players sort of were these wizards, these powerful wizards from throughout the Tolkien lore. Tell me about where that choice came from. That's a really unique way to approach the game. Tell me about that.
We were lucky. So Tolkien, you meet in Lord of the Rings, you meet Radagast, Saruman, and Gandalf. And you're told about the two blue wizards that went into the East. And that's it. You don't have to worry about anything else because they're the only Istari, or the only people with that mission. Resist Sauron, save the free people. They're the only 5 that exist. Now, if you went high elves, you might get double that. If you went Dunedain, and it was just too much, even for us to try and do. It just worked out. Having the 5 wizards is a proverbial good thing for the game. That and the magic items were easy. Okay. The weather system with the doors of night and gates of morning was something Pete was very much instrumental in, because he feels that the stories that are told in the Silmarillion and the Tolkien works they're unique, and it's amazing how people approach the game. Like, some people have a favorite character that they always want to play, and they can identify with it, and then a wizard will show up later. Okay, so that it's not just the wizards you're running; you're running the free people.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, obviously, one of the things that resonates with people so much is being able to start with that sort of starting company or fellowship or whatnot, and sort of have recognizable characters like Boromir or Aragorn or, Frodo or Sam all in there, sort of like basically starting the game, which is something that like card games like, for example, Magic the Gathering doesn't have. You could have a favorite character and you got to wait to draw it. But you guys are obviously pushing this amazing sort of like this company sort of mechanic at the beginning. And I love that so much. Now, just to sort of segue, you mentioned before a little bit about how you had sort of Tolkien people involved in the game, and I heard it broken down that that you guys had a mix of Tolkien scholars and sort of game designers. Tell us a little bit about what that mix was like. Did you find it a boon to create sort of a collectible card game world based on a property, or did you find it restrictive? Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, as I say, I find it helped a lot that there was some limit on what was going on. I am very much a mechanics guy. I can take. I think my strengths are, as a designer, I can take a topic and come up with the bare bones. But I think I'm a developer too. A developer takes a good game and makes it better. And I was willing to listen to anybody who had an idea.
So So obviously after this huge, sort of process, as you said, you're a mechanics guy, you've sort of put in a lot of thought. There's some really innovative things in the game, like the deck reshuffling, that where you can add cards for certain sort of sideboards and stuff eventually. And there's, like, that it can extend the length of the game if you wanted. Tell me, after the game, we mentioned before how playtesting sort of gave you some surprises, especially when it came to the randomized numbers. Tell me, after the game released, what were some of the surprises that you heard after the game had sort of come out? Speaking to playtesting, what were some of the things that the fans and players did that you hadn't really expected them to do?
Well, our first championship was we went all out on the world championships. We had them in England several times. We had them in Belgium. We had them in the States, of course. But the first one was dominated by quick decks, where people would take four of their characters and just split them off and run them. One of them's going to get through. Okay, and then he gets an item and comes back. And anyway, it was, and they would strip the decks down. We eventually put in the deck building rule of you have to have as many hazards as you had resources. And
well, that goes back to what we were saying before about how, you found your playtesters like rebuilt their decks so that the random numbers were so strong. So that's why you had to introduce the dice, correct?
It's a board game pretending to be a collectible card.
It's interesting to hear you say that. A lot of people have speculated that that's sort of the part of the appeal of the game in some capacity.
Yes, it is, but you want to roll dice. I mean, you don't want to flip a card, because you're taking something away, even if it's not really taking it away.
So some of the most interesting things I find about collectible games history is obviously Middle Earth came out with a fantastic license in a powerful sort of time when it was collectible card games were sort of the talk of the the gaming industry. 1995 is often seen as sort of like the peak for like, a lot of games trying to enter it. And obviously Middle Earth was one of the most popular and iconic sort of properties. What are some of the challenges you felt your game faced when it sort of was released in amongst this sort of, for lack of a better term, deluge amongst many other games?
Well, if I had to do it again, I'd do a cleaner basic version and then add the extra rules to allow people to layer their games. Well, you've seen the rules are in these little squares the size of a card, and they're very you have a barrier because of the presentation as well as the so we sold lots of guidebooks and bigger print rules and big stuff, but the general thing was that money was sucked out of the industry. When somebody would have a big release, all the other products other than collectible card games would have a real barrier. So we had to live or die with the card game once we committed to it. Because if you didn't stand out above the others, we had a real problem. We're lucky we got a lot of good reviews. And the reviews that were bad were, it's too complicated, I can't figure this out. Somebody's going to go right back to Magic the Gathering and just continue blasting things with money, cards he bought with money. We actively tried to keep the name characters affordable. We put, we didn't make all the members of the Fellowship rare. A number of them were in the starter decks. So we stood out because of the license, because it's obviously the best license you could have gotten. And it was unencumbered. We had art of the two blue wizards that didn't exist anywhere else. We had all sorts of things we get to make up.
Well, that's such a unique opportunity, right? You get to flesh out one of the most iconic properties in all of not just gaming, but fantasy in general, through design and through, what you guys can have characters do. And the game is so flavorful, and there's so many different things that are possible in the game. It's like somebody is almost, if you look at the game sort of from a 50,000 foot view, it's like somebody is almost writing their own Tolkien novel every game because, you know, there's these new circumstances and everything like that. Now, let me ask you, just zooming out a little bit, obviously you created dozens, thousands of cards for the game. Do you have any one that is especially precious to you, or a set of cards, or some sort of combination that you absolutely love that maybe captured gameplay, as you said, you're a mechanics person, and the lore perfectly in your mind?
Yeah, the thing that I like is the fact that whereas 99 out of 100 games will be victories by marshalling points, but 1 to 5 or 10%, somebody's going to dunk the ring, and you got to worry about it. But if you worry too much, you lose to the point grabbers. It's that dichotomy. I think it's very good. We had one person win the world championship with a ring deck.
A dunk deck, as it was.
Yes, he had hobbits going through the Underdeeps, which I don't know if it means anything, but it's the hobbits are very good because hobbits not only have their ability to steal and resist corruption, they only count as one. The hazard limit of the group is the number of characters.
And hobbits are only half of that, right? They're literally, you know, half men or halflings or whatnot, as it were.
So Gandalf and 2 hobbits the minimum is play 2 hazard cards on something. Well, they can get to that minimum with just three characters, which I just love designing decks. I really like the White Hand. Are you familiar with White Hand?
Absolutely. So obviously, White Hand was the corrupted or fallen wizards, and that actually leads me to my next question. So I was going to ask. Obviously, eventually, you expand out from just the wizards to incorporate player characters that can be either Nazgul, you know, ring wraiths, or you know, fallen wizards. Tell me about where those ideas came from.
Well, we put out way too many cards too fast. The market couldn't absorb the amount of cards we put out. We put out the original set. We put out dragons and then dark minions, and we were starting to reach on cards to do for the good wizards. So we were brainstorming, and we came up with well, there's only 7 Nazgul. We can do the 7 Nazgul as players, as the controllers, and half the stuff will just fall out. People will be familiar with it. Hazards that would kill you can detain you, and which is almost as bad if you're trying to win. It just fell out, and Lilith's Eye, I think it suffers from not having enough playtesting, but in general it's pretty good. Against Shadow was good, but the White Hand is you have all these cards from the Lilith's Eye and the Wizards, and you can pick any character and have him work for you if he's a 5 or less mind, where the scale is 1 to 10. So you have all these interesting characters, but not the heavy hitters from the wizards. And each of the fallen wizards has his own area of corruption. And as they did in the books, everybody's corrupted except for Gandalf. The 2 blue wizards never come back. They either went native or they died. Radagast went native, and Saruman slumped to the dark side. And it's all there. It's its own independent theme in the book of Gandalf resisting, Gandalf persevering, Gandalf saving the day. Yeah. The fact is, any of the wizards could have done that if they.
Well, that's something that's so amazing about this game. You guys sort of captured not just the lore as it's written in the books, but you guys offered this sort of alternative sort of rereading of these amazing sort of characters that people have been so legendarily excited with. And as you mentioned before, there was a bunch of amazing sets you guys came up with. Obviously, things like dragons and dark minions and Against the Shadow, obviously White Hand and Lidless Eye. We've skimmed over a lot of them. But in those sort of expansions, you know, that came out of the Wizards and you guys started doing, was there anything in particular that you really loved? Anything that you like? What was like your, obviously you said that White Hand was your absolute favorite, but was there anything else that sort of stands out as a particularly proud product that you guys crafted?
After years after the game folded, well, we didn't put out any new product. a guy in New York, Joe Biss, did a ARTA game where you play, it's off the same deck. And it has all, you can play it multiplayer. 2 people can play it.
This is like a special fan-created format, you mean?
Yes, and he did some cards for handling things in different ways. I thought I hadn't worked with the card game for years. I did a set of rules for my own ARTA deck, which was, I took all the characters and I put them each in a folder. And so if you're playing the Elrond deck, then you can take Elrond, you take anybody in your folder, and then you can build a small deck of cards specific to elves and that are restricted to hit what he can do. And he can make cards from that nobody else can. And then you have the big deck of items, and it works amazingly well. And you can play multiplayer with it. You don't have to, you can build, form fit a deck pretty carefully. And it's just, I really enjoy that. And I wish we'd kept the license going so that we could have put that out.
Well, it sounds like one of the great advantages of Middle Earth CCG that it makes it stand out. And I've done an episode with this about this subject with another designer. It was one of the very few collectible card games that you could not only play with people, but play by yourself. And that was a great way to sort of explore the world and play all these different sort of amazing sort of combinations without having to worry about, somebody building a degenerate deck that you're just going to have to sort of deal with. Like you could experience the world of Tolkien through this collectible card game, literally either solo or in a campaign, or as you said, during this ARTA sort of alternative sort of thing where everybody can sort of play from the same deck as well. Now, I do want to actually mention about the innovations when it comes to game design that sort of Iron Crown had. And eventually, years after Middle Earth unfortunately sort of fell by the wayside, a revolution in card gaming came out called expandable card games or living card games. But that was in fact something that was already planned for you guys. You guys had done the challenge decks, which were fixed products where you could buy, all the different character decks that were balanced against each other. And then you could also buy the Balrog decks that were, obviously a very powerful sort of deck in and of itself. But these fixed products again, tell me about where that came from and what the plans were. Had Iron Crown or ICE not left the license, you guys were going to explore that sort of space years ahead of its time. Tell me about that.
About what we were planning when.
Yeah, so basically what you're planning with, like, these fixed decks and Balrog and eventually what was going to be Lord of the Rings expandable card game.
Exactly. Basically, the reason you do collectible card games with common, uncommon, and rare is you want to make money. You want to sell as many cards as you can, and it's very attractive if these rare cards dominate play. Well, we did, whereas some rare cards dominated play, lots of cards dominated play. And we were going to put fixed decks, more cards of fixed decks that were less expensive for people to buy. And you didn't have to buy 10 booster boxes. You get them for sure by buying 1 to 2 decks. So that was okay, we're in it for the long run. We're not going to put out cards at the random, but we're going to put out these fixed decks and make our money through connections and a more reliable way to make money. Unfortunately, the movies were announced. And when the movies were announced, Tolkien Enterprises wanted the rights back so they could because we licensed all games for 20 years. And they wanted it back. So we were always underfinanced. So we sell all our stuff during the last quarter of the year. We'd sell 3/4 of our stuff, and then run up a debt during the summer, and then pay it all off at the end. And we did that for years. Well, this time when the movies were announced, they called in the loans and took the license back.
Well, that's one of the most sad things that I heard. Obviously, you guys were doing these amazing work and sort of so far ahead of your time with this expandable card game format that Fantasy Flight Game would hone years later as the living card game through things like, Call of Cthulhu and Game of Thrones and stuff like that. But you guys were doing this way back when, and it's so disappointing to hear that obviously because Hollywood came calling and the licenses became so much more valuable that you guys sort of lost that. Now, tell me, in that time, you guys had obviously planned other things for whether it be fixed format or whether it be collectible, things that I've heard like Elf Lords or even more immediately Dwarf Lords, or even a document that I've seen called Here Be Dragons. Tell me about what plans that you guys had that unfortunately never came to fruition after the license was lost.
Well, as I say, we were running out of theme, so we were going to do elves and dwarves, and we were going to redo the rules, so we have a second edition. That the full-blown part, maybe in a separate book, would be the game as it stood, and then there'd be a simple game that used the cards, but took the things that confused people and made them think it was complex, and did a set of rules like that. Now, there's a group in Germany that has put out some of the cards, so in those limits. But they only do it for the people that use them.
Well, I mean, it's obviously something that obviously the fan groups have endured, and obviously for years there has been people who have been making custom cards and dream cards, as they're called, through the Council of Elrond, which is the Palea committee for this particular type of game. So tell me, like, after obviously, unfortunately, Middle Earth CCG sort of fell by the wayside. Tell me a little bit more about sort of what your perspective was as far as obviously after you guys had the license, Decipher had the license, and actually your colleague at Iron Crown or Ice ended up working on the Lord of the Rings trading card game by Decipher. How did you feel about that product? Tell me about your perspective as far as that product goes.
Well, that's Mike Reynolds who went there, and Mike did a great job, but they had restrictions. The license restrictions fell on them. Since they were doing all these games, licensing all these games, they had certain rules, like you needed to use art from the movie. They ended up doing what we did, and half your cards are hazards and half your cards are resources. But you can have two Gandalfs or two Aragorns, and it's like, instead of being the game it is now, it's a race game. Both sides are attempt. I haven't only played it once, and it was a long time ago. But you have Frodo rushing to beat Frodo to the ring.
It was a sort of awkward back and forth where narratively, flavorfully, it was like you were playing two halves of the same game.
There's only so much you can do with collectible card games. Once somebody has 2,000 cards or 1,500 cards or whatever you have, you're really stretching. All you're doing is adding a different variation on.
Now, just to sort of wrap up the time with IC and the time with the Middle Earth card game, have you been involved with the Middle Earth or the MECCG sort of community or anything since officially stepping away? Like in the last sort of what has it been, almost over 20 years at this point since the game sort of fell by the wayside. Tell me, what's your experience been with the game since stepping away as its sort of the lead designer of it?
One Gen Con, somebody was running a tournament, and I just went and signed up and showed up, played, and won the game. So, and he had a prize. His wife had made some amulet or something like that. And I said, well, I really shouldn't take this because I designed the game and I don't know if you're there. So he was very nice, and I gave me the amulet. And I went and played. I played several times with him at Gen Con. He's the one that did the art of game. And I love doing the art of stuff. I would play that. And of course, I immediately didn't leave the industry. When Iron Crown went bankrupt, I went to work for Mayfair Games. Eventually became the managing editor. And we put out lots and lots of board games. And of course, Catan.
Well, I mean, Catan is so iconic, right? Like it's such an iconic game, and the fact that you and the team at Mayfair was able to expand it into the not just the the hobby brand, but the global brand that it is nowadays. And obviously, your old colleague from way back from those Dungeons and Dragons games in the 1970s. Pete Felton is obviously the head of Catan Studios now and is continuing that brand on. I'm so amazed at how that history threads through the gaming industry for over almost 40 years now. It's absolutely amazing. Now, before we go, we do have a couple of things to do. I do want to ask you some questions from people from the community, people who still play Middle Earth CCG all these years later, who still love all the work you guys did there at Iron Crown Enterprises or ICE. And especially, I want to shout out our first question, which is Chris Prather. He was the one who sort of connected us and sort of made this whole thing possible. So I do want to say thank you very much to Chris, but I want to ask his question. He wants to know, was there anything that obviously we talked about the sets that sort of fell by the wayside, Elf Lords, Dwarf Lords, the Dragon set, but was there anything else sort of during the core sort of development of that game that you couldn't include, whether it be for license reasons or anything like that? If you would be able to do it again, was there anything else that you would want to see in the game and or add in that you were never able to do at that original time?
Well, I think we had pretty much free lands. The approval process, as long as we were sending them money, didn't have a problem. I think ARTA is the one thing I would have done. When we put out the challenge checks, I would have worked at some sort of art play that too.
Well, again, that's that sort of single deck, sort of fan created format where multiple players can play all at once. And it's a sort of almost like a cube experience. If you've never played sort of other collectible card games, it's sort of like like a contained experience. It's really fascinating. Now, I do want to shout out the next question, which is from Gianluca Bertucci. He's a personal friend of mine, and he has been playing this game since 1995. And he claims as one of the best collectible card game collectors in the world that this is his absolute favorite collectible card game of all time. He wants to know what your thoughts are on the continuous growth of the game and the fan dedication of the past 27 years since its first launch. What's your perspective on the fact that people are still engaging with the game to this day?
I'm just overwhelmed. I'm very proud that it still has that effect on people, and it goes as Rollmaster and Merc too. I've had people come up to me and say, I played this for years. It's got great memories for me. But the collectible card game is just endless amounts of things you can try and do, and it's got that right mixture of luck and skill, I think. And as any collectible card game, you can spend 3 or 4 times as much time designing the deck as you do even do playing it. So you always have the full game experience in front of you because you can always design a deck. I particularly like running LotR, Bjorn, Elrond decks because they can just rack up stuff. Anyway, it's just fun. I don't mind if they get corrupted every once in a while. I lose a game. Losing games is just part of the experience.
Well, that's one of the things I love about collectible card games. Sometimes, depending on your approach, having fun can obviously sometimes be the absolute key to that. And obviously, you mentioned Elrond there. The Council of Elrond is obviously a huge worldwide group that keeps this game going, and they'll be linked in the description. So we can, so if you're not part of that group or not part of the fan community, which is also on Facebook and a couple other places, I will link all that in the description as well. Now, the next question I have from a continuing player for all these years is Rolf Montano. He asks, there was a lot through the design. Obviously, we mentioned throughout the episode that it was a very quick design process for you initially. Tell us about how errata and clarifications for cards came about. What was the process with dealing with these? Because there was quite a few when it came to your Middle Earth CCG. There was quite a few sort of things that had to get updated or changed and stuff like that. What was the process internally for dealing with those kind of problems as the game sort of saw them?
Well, we were lucky we could do the unlimited series because that closed many of the gaps. It made it at least a little bit more reasonable. But most of the problems or the errata are caused by lack of time for playtesting.
So we do have another community question here, and before we ask it, it comes from Justin B. Hopkins, and he just wants to let you know that thank you so much, because he has loved this game for decades now, and it has kept his family and friend connected over seas, over continents, over languages for years and years and years. So he does want to let you know how much he appreciates the work that you guys did, even in that short period that we discussed before. It's obviously had such a longevity, and that means obviously you guys did something right. But his question is about the initial playtesting. Obviously, you know, you guys mentioned that you realized you had to take away the random numbers and add in the dice and stuff like that. But were there any other stories or anything about playtesting that you could share for Justin there?
Mainly it was our playtesters found loopholes. Like corruption used to be just play as many cards as you want. Well, that didn't work. So you can only play one a turn. That's got to be a mechanism to take it off. So having the corruption work is, I think, one of the big selling points. It's a great feature for the game because it allows you to be flexible in terms of the characters and to have something that they're more scared of than a sword, you know, sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's definitely, and it's so thematic. You know, we mentioned it in the intro, but this game is so flavorful, and having that element to the game adds so much. You know, obviously characters like Boromir are more susceptible to things like corruption checks and stuff. It's a really fantastic mechanic in the game itself.
That and sideboards.
Oh, the sideboards were very innovative with the reshuffling and being able to change a strategy mid-game.
Yeah.
The next, last and final community question I have comes from Stephen Radovan Davik. I'm sorry if I butchered that. And he is curious about your approach and thoughts on game design and power creep in collectible card games in general. Obviously, as sets come out, there is that temptation to add more powerful cards in it. Is that something you guys found as far as Middle Earth goes? Was that something you guys were tempted to do? Did you guys decide to sort of add more complexity and power as more sets went on, or did you try and keep it sort of at the same level as the Wizards was throughout the life of that game?
The power creep, I don't think the power creep was there. Some of the characters, oh, I know, the only thing are the deck manipulation cards, the smoke rings and I forget the other one, the tobacco. I forget what the other one was, but there are only two of those really. No, actually there's more, but they're not overwhelming. You know, the fact you can manipulate the cards using like tapping your wizard, where you lose the wizard for a whole turn. You get the cards in from the sideboard, so you have to pay something to get something. So we may have more flexible cards, but I don't know if they're more powerful.
Well, I mean, that was one of the amazing things about how the game grew over time. You know, it added so much more flavor. It did add a lot of rules, sort of, you know, complexity. You know, we mentioned it during the interview. You know, the Underdeep and stuff like that. There was new sort of sites and all that sort of stuff that you guys explored, and many other things that you guys plan to do as well. That sort of brings us to the end of community questions. I want to thank both you and everybody in the community who helped and submitted questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to every single one of them, but before we go today, there is one last thing we need to do, and that is the segment I like to call Kraken Questions.
Release the Kraken.
In this segment, basically all you have to do is choose one of these 3 colored booster packs. I'm going to rip it open. There is 3 common silly questions and 1 rare game design related question. You tell me which color you'd like, and we'll take it from there to send out the episode.
Red.
Red it is. Excellent. It goes faster, this booster pack, I'm sure that they would say. So let's have a look and see what questions are in the red booster pack. So, common question number 1. Oh, okay. This is an interesting one. If you could be magically proficient at any Olympic sport, what Olympic sport would you choose to be proficient at?
Decathlon.
Well, that's all of them, isn't it? It's all of them in one, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've got running, you got long jump. That's the role player's answer. I love that answer for sure.
Just what they'd say, the biathlon could work too, because what the guy in the biathlon has a rifle.
Well, that's definitely a skill, marksmanship for sure. All right, so silly question number 2. Oh, what is your favorite fan convention memory?
I guess playing the the collectible card game Common Stack, the ARTA game.
That's an iconic moment for, obviously, this fan-created sort of moment in the collectible card game space. And as you said before, it's something that you would want to see in the game itself. I love that answer. I think that's fantastic. This is a real simple one. Who do you personally think wins between Godzilla and King Kong?
Godzilla.
Well, he's got the breath, right?
Look, the monkey is quicker, but one shot and he's gone. Godzilla's half armored, and he's bigger, much bigger.
Again, I love that role player game answer. You're thinking about armor, you're thinking about offense. I love it. The final question, which is the rare question of the booster pack, it is a game design related question, or at least a career related question for you. Is there anything that you, a project that you tried to get going throughout your career, or anything that never saw the light of day that you had wished had been actually released? Is there anything that that you really tried to get out and that unfortunately fell by the wayside?
Well, that's a complex problem for me because I spent most of my career being a managing editor and a developer. So if I push one of my own games, it adds an element of conflict of interest with a lot of the others. I usually did games that we needed as a company to get done. So I've got a dozen different designs that never saw the light of day because they're good games, but it's not something the company needed at the time.
Well, as well, I mean, we can also speak to those other sets that we talked about for Lord of the Rings, whether it's Elf Lords or Dwarf Lords or Here Be Dragons or any of those other ones that you guys had sort of worked on internally as well. So thank you so much for that thoughtful answer. Now, before we leave today, I do want to do a couple of things. I want to thank Chris Prather, who was able to connect us and made this episode possible. He is obviously somebody who's very enthusiastic about Middle Earth CCG and is very enthusiastic about the collectible game space. So I do want to shout him out and say how grateful I am for his message and the ability to sort of create this episode between us. The other thing I want to ask you about, is there anything exciting or anything that you want to tell the audience of this episode about to sort of either keep an eye out for or anything like that?
Just a couple of things. There's a convention here in Charlottesville every February called PrezCon. That's kind of something I'd call that because I'll be there. If somebody wants to play a game with me or just talk over the old days, I'll be around.
Oh, that's amazing. So I will make sure I link PrezCon in the description. And if I'm not mistaken, that was one that was originally founded by your co-designer on Middle Earth CCG, Mike Reynolds, way back in the 90s.
Yes, he was involved in it. But anyway, because I'm always welcome to have visitors and maybe play a game if you come through Charlottesville.
Well, that's absolutely amazing. I will link PrezCon in the description. And obviously, if you're at Charlottesville, that would be absolutely amazing for you to sort of check in and sort of play. And you could meet Coleman in person, who's obviously still playing Middle Earth CCG all these years later, and many other of the games that he's designed and other ones that he's explored as well.
Yeah.
Before we leave, I do want to mention, obviously, for those interested, if you're not already a part of the Middle Earth CCG community, there's a fantastic group on Facebook that you can join. And of course, there is the sort of the player committee that keeps this game alive and has super events in Germany every year, a collective, where people get together and play this game and many other sort of Lord of the Rings based games called Lore of Middle Earth. That's run by the Council of Elrond, and all of that will be linked in the description or the show notes of this particular episode. Before we get out of here, I do want to say one more thing. Thank you so much, Coleman, for joining me today, for sharing your game, for sharing your stories, and creating such a milestone in collectible card game history. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And you're welcome.
So before we get out of here, I just want to say again, thank you so much, Coleman. Goodbye from me. Goodbye from you, bud.
Yes, goodbye and good luck.
And good luck to you as well.
As my friend once said, I can beat you, but I can't beat these dice.
And such is random chance. All right, so that is it for this episode of the Booster Pack. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, of course, again to Coleman. And until next time, remember, keep shuffling. And there you have it, our episode with Coleman Charton, who actually designed the Middle Earth CCG. Now, this episode was very, very long, and unfortunately, I had to cut it up a little bit more than normal because Coleman was so generous with the stories that he told, and I hope perhaps one day you'll be able to see some bonus content or an extra episode or something like that with some of the other stories that he shared in his time in the gaming industry, not just in collectible card games, but all over the industry in general. And there was some fascinating stuff there. I just want to say thank you so much to him for joining me today and spending so much time with me. And I want to say thank you to you guys for joining me for this whole episode. Now, please take a look at the description of this episode, whether it's on the podcast or YouTube, because you will find a whole bunch of links. And the one I want to call out, of course, is not only PrezCon that Coleman mentioned, but also the Council of Elrond, who still keep this game alive nowadays, and the Facebook group, of course, for the Middle Earth CCG. If you're somebody who loves this game or is interested in this game, jump into any of those groups and find another player to sort of learn the game and sort of get into and whatnot. Also, if you want to build out a collection, be sure to check out Category 1 Games, who is our sponsor for this show. They actually have a whole bunch of cards listed for this game on their website as well, so you can check them out. They'll be linked in the description too. Now, as for me, I've been Rands. You can find me on social media via @CCG History, either on Facebook or on Twitter, or if you have a look in the description, there'll be a whole bunch of other stuff, including an email and a listener survey that you can also reach out to me from as well. DMs are also open on all social media, so if you have anything to say about this episode, or you want to share anything, feel free to reach me there, or via the email address in the description, or of course, a comment or review on this episode wherever you've particularly watched it. And I, again, appreciate you guys checking it out. That's about it for me. Thank you so much for this episode of the Booster Pack, and thank you so much for joining me. I cannot be grateful enough. It has been an absolute pleasure. Lastly, I just want to shout out Chris Prather. I mentioned him a couple of times in the episode, but he is the reason this episode exists. So if you're a member of the MECCG community or anything like that, and you see him around, shout him a thanks for this particular thing, because he connected me and Coleman so that we could have this conversation. So that's about it. Thank you so much. And until next time, I've said it once and I will say it again. Remember, keep shuffling.